Daniel and Marissa Thompson had spent years searching for the perfect home, and when they stumbled upon the 4.5-acre equestrian estate in Sylmar, California, they knew they had found something special. The property had a rich history, once owned by a famous Hollywood couple. It was a peaceful retreat nestled against the hills, with sprawling stables and a main house full of rustic charm. To them, it was more than just a house. It was a sanctuary. The couple had recently left the chaos of Los Angeles behind, hoping to raise their 7-year-old son, Oliver, in a quieter setting. But from the moment they moved in, strange things began to happen. Doors that had been locked at night would be found wide open in the morning. The scent of cigarette smoke lingered in the air despite neither of them being smokers. And then there were the sounds, footsteps in the hallway, the faint hum of music drifting through the house in the dead of night. "It's just an old house settling," Daniel would say, trying to reassure Marissa, but deep down he wasn't so sure. One evening, Marissa was organizing the living room when she found a small box tucked away behind a cabinet. Inside were old photographs, black and white stills of the ranch in its prime. Among them was an image that made her pause. A blurred figure standing near the stables, watching from a distance. That same night, Oliver ran into their bedroom, his face pale. "Mom," he whispered, "there's a man outside." Marissa rushed to the window. The yard was empty. "Are you sure, honey?" Oliver nodded. He was standing by the fence. He looked sad. The next morning, she found something that made her stomach tighten. A faint set of footprints in the dirt near the stables. The night before, it had rained. No one had been outside. Determined to understand what was happening, Marissa started researching the property's past. She read stories about its former owners, about the deep love one of them had for the ranch, and how it had been their sanctuary in life. She also learned something else. One of the previous owners had been known for spending hours in the stables, often accompanied by the scent of cigarettes and music drifting from an old radio. Her mind raced. Was that what she had been hearing? That evening, she placed an old radio in the barn and left it on a static-filled channel. She asked a simple question: "Is someone here?" For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, through the static, the faintest sound of a melody broke through, an old song, one she couldn't quite place, but it sent shivers down her spine. That night, Marissa dreamed of the barn. She stood in the dim light, surrounded by the scent of hay and leather. A man stood nearby, his face obscured, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. He exhaled smoke and whispered, "Tell her I'm okay." She woke up in tears, the words echoing in her mind. She didn't know who her was, but she felt an overwhelming sense of peace, like someone had been waiting to send that message for a long time. After that night, the disturbances faded. The music stopped. The footsteps ceased. Even the smell of smoke disappeared. It was as if whatever had been lingering had finally found closure. Marissa never tried to dig deeper. Some things, she decided, were better left as whispers in the past. The air in the house felt different in the days that followed. Not lighter, Marissa wouldn't describe it as relief, but different. Like the weight of unseen eyes had lifted, leaving behind an emptiness that was almost lonelier than the presence itself. She noticed it in the way the silence stretched longer at night, how the once familiar sounds of creaking wood and distant music had vanished without fanfare, leaving only the rustling of trees beyond their bedroom window. Oliver stopped waking up in the middle of the night. He no longer spoke of the man by the fence, no longer lingered near the window as if expecting to see something waiting for him in the dark. It should have comforted Marissa, knowing that whatever had haunted them had moved on. And yet, she found herself hesitating in doorways, expecting to hear the soft hum of a song she could never quite name, or catch the fleeting scent of smoke curling through the hallways. But there was nothing. She told herself it was over. Then the horses started acting strangely. It began subtly, an anxious twitch of their ears, a hesitation before stepping into their stalls, deep, snorting breaths as if trying to catch a scent that eluded human senses. But soon, the unease turned into something undeniable. One night, Daniel woke to the sound of frantic whinnying, the sharp clatter of hooves against wood echoing through the property. By the time they reached the stables, the horses were restless, shifting nervously, their eyes rolling white in the dim light of the hanging barn lamp. Marissa pressed a soothing hand against the flank of their mare, whisper, but the horse flinched beneath her touch, muscles twitching beneath a coat damp with sweat. Daniel checked the stalls, his flashlight sweeping across the wooden beams, pausing at the doors. "Nothing got in," he murmured, mostly to himself. No coyotes, no signs of a break-in. But Marissa wasn't convinced. She could feel it in the air, thick, charged, like the moments before a summer storm. She turned toward the open doorway, her gaze drifting across the dark expanse of their property. And then, just for a second, she saw it, just a shift in the shadows, a flicker of movement at the far end of the fence, where the property met the rolling hills beyond. A shape too tall to be an animal, too still to be imagined. A man, watching, waiting, her breath caught in her throat, and just like that, the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness. She wanted to believe it was nothing, a trick of her tired mind, the remnants of her own paranoia feeding on sleepless nights and Oliver's words. But deep down, she knew, it was never really over. The night air pressed against Marissa's skin like a damp cloth, thick with the scent of earth and distant rain. Somewhere in the hills beyond the ranch, a coyote howled a long, wavering cry that echoed into the silence. The horses remained restless, their ears twitching at every rustling leaf, their nervous exhales misting in the cool air. Daniel, still gripping the flashlight, scanned the fence line again. "Did you see something?" His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it, like he already knew the answer. Marissa swallowed hard, forcing herself to blink, to push away the lingering image of the figure she swore had been there. "I thought maybe it could have been nothing." She didn't believe that. Not really. Daniel exhaled through his nose, his grip tightening around the flashlight. He was the kind of man who didn't like to entertain the idea of the supernatural, not out loud. Anyway, he had always been the rational one, the one who could explain away every creak in the floorboards, every flickering light, every shadow where there shouldn't be one. But there was something in his expression tonight, something uneasy that told Marissa he wasn't as sure as he wanted to be. "Let's get back inside," he said finally. "We'll check the security cameras in the morning." She nodded, but as they turned away from the barn, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching them. The footage revealed nothing. The next morning, after a restless few hours of sleep, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through the recordings on his laptop. The security cameras had captured the horses' frantic movements, their anxious pacing and sudden jerks of their heads toward the fence line, but no intruder, no strange figure lurking in the dark. "No one was there," Daniel muttered, rubbing his jaw. "Not a damn thing." Marissa stood behind him, arms crossed over her chest. Then why were the horses acting like that? Maybe a mountain lion was prowling nearby. There were no tracks. He sighed, closing the laptop with more force than necessary. "I don't know, Marissa, but I do know that if you start seeing ghosts every time something weird happens, we're going to drive ourselves insane." She didn't argue. She didn't tell him that, for the first time, she wasn't afraid of insanity. She was afraid of something much worse. The days passed, and for a little while the house was still. Marissa convinced herself that the worst had passed, that the strange presence, whatever it had been, had truly left them. She forced herself to stop thinking about the figure at the fence, the eerie familiarity of the lingering cigarette smoke. She even convinced herself that Oliver's insistence on keeping his bedroom door locked at night was just a phase, a lingering fear from the move. Then, one evening, she heard the piano. She was in the kitchen, drying dishes as the sun dipped below the hills, casting the ranch in deep amber light. Daniel was outside, tending to the horses, and Oliver was upstairs playing with his toys. The house was otherwise silent. And yet, the unmistakable sound of piano keys being pressed drifted through the hall's soft, hesitant notes, as if someone were playing a song half-remembered. The plate slipped from Marissa's hands, landing in the sink with a dull thud. She turned toward the doorway, heart pounding against her ribs. The piano was in the sitting room, a heavy antique piece that had come with the house. It hadn't been tuned in years, and no one in the family knew how to play. She stepped forward cautiously, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. The music continued slow, unsteady, as if whoever was playing was struggling to recall the melody. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Marissa reached the doorway and froze. The room was empty. The piano sat undisturbed, its lid closed. Dust motes danced in the golden evening light, swirling lazily in the air. A chill crept down her spine. She walked to the piano, pressing her fingertips against the smooth, aged wood. With a hesitant breath, she lifted the lid, exposing the ivory keys beneath. And there, settled in the dust, were the unmistakable imprints of fingertips, fresh, deliberate, trailing along the keys as if someone had been playing only moments before. A shiver crawled up her arms. Behind her, the floor creaked. She spun, her breath catching in her throat. But there was no one there. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. For a long moment, Marissa stood frozen in place, her breath caught in her throat. The house was silent again, but it was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting. The setting sun cast long, fractured shadows across the floor, stretching from the windows like grasping fingers. She slowly lowered the lid of the piano, the soft click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud in the hush of the room. The air felt heavier here, charged with something unseen but undeniably present. She knew what she had seen: fresh imprints on the dust-covered keys, trailing across the instrument in a path of deliberate, knowing movement. A cold sensation prickled at the back of her neck, as though someone were standing just behind her, watching. She clenched her jaw and forced herself to turn. Nothing. The doorway was empty. The hall beyond stretched into dimness, lined with family photos that suddenly felt misplaced, like artifacts from another life. The floorboard that had creaked just moments ago remained still, the wood unmoved. She let out a slow breath, willing herself to move. The house wasn't haunted. Couldn't be. But as she made her way back toward the kitchen, her body remained tense, her ears straining for another sound. Another shift in the air that would tell her she wasn't alone. She heard nothing, but she felt it. That night, she didn't tell Daniel what had happened. She wanted to, but as they sat together on the couch, a movie playing in the background, she found herself unable to form the words. It wasn't just fear of his skepticism, it was something deeper, something almost superstitious. As if speaking it aloud would give it weight, would pull it closer. So she said nothing. But as they went upstairs to bed, she caught sight of Oliver's door. It was shut, locked from the inside. She hesitated, then lightly knocked. "Oliver? You okay?" There was a pause, then his small voice. "Yeah. You sure?" Another pause. Then quieter. "He doesn't come in when the door is locked." A cold wave of unease rolled through her stomach. "Who?" Silence. She swallowed hard, resting her hand against the door. "Oliver." Open the door for a second. A rustle of blankets. The soft click of the lock turning. She opened the door slowly. Oliver sat cross-legged in the middle of his bed, his stuffed dinosaur clutched tightly in his arms. The curtains were drawn, the only light coming from the small lamp on his nightstand. The air in the room felt undisturbed, calm except for one thing. The rocking chair by the window. It was moving, just the faintest sway, barely perceptible. The kind of motion that could have been caused by a draft, a shift in the floor. But there was no draft, and Marissa had never seen it move before. Her throat went dry. "Why do you lock the door?" Oliver looked at her with wide, serious eyes. "Because he watches." A chill prickled along her arms. "Who watches?" Oliver hesitated, then finally whispered, "The cowboy." Marissa's breath caught. She forced herself to stay calm, to keep her voice steady. "What does he look like?" Oliver looked toward the rocking chair, then back at her. "I don't know. He's mostly a shadow." He clutched his dinosaur tighter. "But I know he smokes." She stared at him, her heartbeat slow and heavy in her chest. "Why do you say that?" she asked carefully. Oliver scrunched his nose, as if the answer was obvious. "Because I can smell it." Marissa's hands curled into fists. The scent of cigarettes. The footprints by the stables. The music on the piano. She forced a reassuring smile, brushing a hand over Oliver's hair. "It's okay, baby. You're safe." He nodded, but she could tell he wasn't convinced. Neither was she. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Marissa lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Daniel's quiet breathing beside her the only sound in the room. The events of the past weeks played over in her mind, each strange occurrence slotting into place like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet see clearly. The figure by the fence, the way the horses had spooked, the music, the whisper of movement behind her, and now Oliver's shadowy cowboy. At some point, exhaustion finally pulled her under, her thoughts fraying into dreams she wouldn't remember. And then, a sound, soft at first, distant, but unmistakable. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, moving across the wooden floor just outside the bedroom. Marissa's eyes snapped open. She barely breathed, her pulse hammering against her ribs. The footsteps continued passing her door, heading down the hall. Not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The house was silent again. Marissa turned her head, listening. Nothing, but the air felt wrong. Carefully, she shifted out of bed, moving as quietly as possible. The floor was cold beneath her feet as she padded toward the door, her fingers hesitating on the handle. She pressed her ear against the wood. Still nothing. Slowly, she turned the knob and eased the door open, peering into the dim hallway. The old wooden floor stretched before her, bathed in faint moonlight from the window at the end of the corridor. The air was still, but there just outside Oliver's door, faint but unmistakable, a single boot print, and the lingering scent of smoke. Marissa stared at the boot print, her pulse pounding in her ears. The wooden floor, normally cool and smooth beneath her feet, suddenly felt unsteady, like the house itself had shifted under her weight. The print was deep, pressed into the faint layer of dust that had settled in the hallway's corners. She swallowed hard. It wasn't Oliver's. It wasn't Daniel's. It was larger, heavier, and it hadn't been there before. The scent of smoke still lingered, curling through the air in ghostly tendrils. She forced herself forward, her feet silent against the floor. Oliver's door was shut. She hesitated, then placed her hand against the wood, feeling for warmth, for movement, for anything beyond the unnatural stillness pressing against her. A slow creak echoed from somewhere further down the hall. Her breath hitched. It wasn't Oliver. It wasn't Daniel. Something else was awake in the house. She turned sharply toward the noise, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. The sitting room, the piano, and then, before she even reached the doorway, the sound returned. Soft, deliberate keystrokes. The same hesitant melody, barely formed, as if someone were trying to recall a song from another lifetime. Marissa's fingers curled against her palms. The air had turned thick again, pressing against her skin like unseen hands. She stepped into the sitting room. The piano was open, the keys moved, and the bench was empty. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Her mind fought to rationalize what she was seeing: the slow, careful depression of each key, the faint vibration of the old strings. But there was no body, no hands, nothing sitting at the bench. Just the music. She wanted to run, to wake Daniel, to grab Oliver and leave, but something held her there. A force that wasn't entirely fear, something deeper, something colder. A whisper, not a voice, not words, but the sensation of something shifting in the air just behind her. She turned. The room was empty, but then she saw it. A shadow, darker than the dimness around it, standing just beyond the reach of the moonlight near the window. Tall, broad, the shape of a man in a wide-brimmed hat. The scent of smoke deepened, wrapping around her throat like a silent warning. The shadow didn't move. Neither did she. Marissa's breath came in short, uneven pulls, her body screaming for her to run, but her legs refused to obey. And then, the hat tilted. A slow, deliberate movement, a gesture of acknowledgement, a recognition. And just like that, the shadow stepped backward into the darkness and was gone. The room fell silent. The scent of smoke dissipated. The weight in the air lifted. And the piano lid slammed shut with a final, echoing clap. They left the house 2 weeks later. There was no single event that drove them out, no violent attack, no physical harm, no definitive proof of what they had seen. But the feeling lingered, that undeniable presence, the quiet knowledge that they were sharing the space with someone that had no intention of leaving. The real estate agent had been polite when they listed the property, offering a neutral smile when Marissa hesitated over the question of why they were selling so soon. "Did you ever feel anything?" Marissa had asked cautiously. The woman had only smiled, gathering her papers. "It's a beautiful house, and sometimes the past just doesn't like to be forgotten." She never elaborated. Months later, settled into a newer, brighter home miles away, Marissa still found herself waking in the middle of the night, expecting to hear the piano. Oliver never spoke of the cowboy again. Daniel never asked if she had really seen anything. But sometimes, just before she drifted to sleep, Marissa thought she caught the faintest scent of smoke in the air, and she wondered if the cowboy had ever truly let them go. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.